Greetings, peoples of the interwebs, Jake here. So, continuing with the trend of doing another Middle-earth related video, because I've really enjoyed doing these, and they're doing pretty well, like, viewership-wise for this tiny channel. So, all the more reason to continue doing so. Now, I was actually debating between two topics to do this video on, so I may do the next one after this one. But basically, I was debating on doing a video on, like, the hobbits and why they're so resilient to the One Ring, and then, of course, the video you're watching now is kind of about, like, orcs, the different kinds of orcs, and a little bit about their culture, because, I don't know, I feel like, even though there are a lot of, Tolkien YouTubers who have, detailed, like, these, like, orcs, and, are they inherently evil, and all that stuff, I don't know, I still feel like the topic of orcs don't get covered nearly as much as, like, other topics from Lord of the Rings, and, Middle-earth, throughout its many ages. And so, and then, kind of just want to give my own take. So, all that to say, that's what this video is about, is my thoughts on kind of like, the orcs and the different kinds of orcs, like the Uruk-hai, and even the different kinds of orcs, like the Mori orcs, the Gundabad orcs, all that jazz. Because Tolkien, even though he didn't obviously like write as extensively about the orcs and like their culture and stuff like that compared to the other races, like your elves, humans, and dwarves, and all that, I think what's interesting is there's still enough there to kind of get some insight into their culture. Because first off, just to go ahead and address it, is Tolkien even said that like orcs aren't inherently evil. They're just more prone to corruption because they were that's how they were created, or that's one of the origins. It's actually Tolkien never really officially decided on what origin he wanted for the orcs, but I think the kind of most common theory or common I guess conclusion, or of the origins that most people seem to accept, and I think makes the most sense, is the fact that orcs were at one point elves that Morgoth, the first Dark Lord, corrupted, and then kind of mutated into his own beings, later the orcs. And then, of course, later generations, Sauron and Saruman kind of started to, make different kinds of orcs, like the Uruk-hai. So first off, with that out of the way, we'll just stick with, like, the origin that, the orcs were, mutated elves, basically, corrupted elves. So, anywho, now we don't know, like, if the orcs maintain, like, the immortal lifespan of elves, but I would say more than likely not. That's probably something that Morgoth wasn't able to replicate when he was corrupting him. Because another thing, too, going really deep into the lore, is, so all beings, in particular elves, that I think Tolkien wrote the most about, is, so there's the Fea, which is kind of like your soul, basically, like your inner spirit, and then the Hroa, which is basically like your outer body, so your physical body. And so the elves, in particular, I don't think the other races had this ability, but basically the elves, so like if their bodies were put under like great stress, like incredibly tense stress, or even mental stress, they could essentially, like, just eject their Fea out of their bodies, and their physical bodies would just be like a husk. And so that's where some people kind of think that, like, orcs were, like, again, the initial elves that Morgoth tortured. They kind of, ejected their Fea from their bodies, and then Morgoth essentially kind of, in a way, orcs are almost automatons. Maybe not quite that simplistic, but that's kind of where some people speculate is, like, how the orcs came to be, and more than likely don't have the immortal lives that the elves do. They probably have lifespans comparable to humans, maybe a little bit less. Actually, probably a little bit less, just because they are a very, like, martial culture, and, violence is a big part of their culture. So I would say, if you're an orc, like the average orc, and you're, say, like 60 years old, you've probably done pretty good, and that probably means you're a badass because you've survived this long. And again, this is kind of more speculation on my part, but I would think also the older the orc gets is, maybe formidable as they once were, or maybe even still are, like maybe, like some humans, they're still, in really good condition, really physically active and stuff like that, even like their 50s and 60s. But those are kind of outliers. Um, and so probably the same thing with orcs. And so I'd imagine even if there was an orc that was like, say 65 years old and they were still pretty fit, these younger orcs would probably be like, well, if I gotta, I gotta prove I'm awesome and like I gotta get respect, so I'm gonna challenge that dude to a fight, and if I beat him, maybe I become the leader. So that's kind of a little bit more speculation on my part, but I think that would track again with what little we do know about the orcs, because we do know that they are again a very martial people, and violence is pretty commonplace with their culture. However, there are glimpses into Orcish society that makes me think that it wasn't purely, I guess, all violence, because in the Fellowship, so basically, or actually this would be flash forwarding to the Two Towers where this scene takes place, but basically, like, so after the Fellowship escapes Moria, in the Two Towers, and this scene is in the Two Towers movie. I don't remember if it's in the theatrical or the extended edition, but basically, it plays out very similarly, where you have the Uruk-hai, who have captured Merry and Pippin, and they're heading towards Isengard, and then that's when the Mordor orcs kind of pop up, and they're kind of like, hey, you guys are late, and then there's a bit of, like, not a physical confrontation, but definitely, like, a verbal confrontation between the Mordor orcs and then the Isengarders. And then in the books, there's actually a third faction, the orcs from the Misty Mountains, who basically were pissed off that the Fellowship just waltzed up in their homes and just started killing a bunch of orcs. And so they're out for vengeance. And so they actually want to take Merry and Pippin, because they're like, well, hey, these guys were partially responsible for killing some of our guys, so we want to kill them. And then there's this whole verbal debate amongst the three different factions, the Uruk-hai obviously being bigger and stronger than the typical orcs, are basically like, hey, so we're stronger than you, and we have our specific orders that we are to bring them to Isengard, unspoiled and, untainted, so back off. And then, of course, the Mordor orcs, they kind of are aware that Saruman has betrayed Sauron at this point, and so they're kind of like, well, we've got our own orders, so we want those guys too if there's any kind of, I think, I may be misremembering this, but I believe the Mordor orcs kind of similarly suspect that the two halflings, one of them might have the ring, or even if they didn't have the ring, obviously they could still, take them as prisoners and, interrogate them for more information about, the Fellowship and all that stuff. So that's where, like, this kind of verbal clash starts to happen before, like, the all-out brawl takes place, where, again, all of them have their own reasons, own motivations, their own orders, or the Moria orcs' lack of orders and just out for revenge. But that's still an interesting trait that, I guess it shows that, like, the orcs may not have, I mean, maybe there is some orcs that had compassion for, like, their fallen comrades, but even if it's not compassion, that still shows that there is some kind of structure in Orcish society to where, if someone just waltzes in, kills some of their tribe or, country people or whatever, as violent as they are, they're not just going to kind of be like, well, I guess they just weren't strong enough, sucks to be them. They're still going to have some kind of motivation. Again, it seemed like it was mostly out of revenge, but even still, that still is a small glimpse into Orcish culture, even if this is more isolated to the Misty Mountain orcs. That there is some kind of, I don't know, human traits. They aren't just like these evil, killing machines with no remorse or anything like that. And then, of course, the Uruk-hai also kind of believe that they're superior to the others, and so they're kind of like making all these remarks of kind of like, oh, you guys are just like little, worms and maggots and, all these demeaning remarks. And that, basically it's like, if it wasn't for us, like, you all wouldn't be able to make the trek back to, like, Mordor or, wherever you're coming from. Because basically they're traveling across Rohan, and so Ugluk, the leader of the Uruk-hai, is basically like, yeah, we all hate each other's guts, but we should still travel together, because we're traveling across the land of the Horse Lords and very dangerous, so we have a better chance of survival. So again, that also shows that even though the Uruk-hai definitely don't like the other orcs because they feel they're inferior to them, there is still that level of, yeah, but working together is still the best way for us to survive. So again, there's still like these glimpses of, again, humanistic traits in the orcs Uruk-hai. And then, of course, there's still the debate, like, the mortal orcs are saying that, it's like, oh, well, we've got the Nazgul, flying around, so, we're probably okay. But, of course, Ukla kind of counters to Grishnak, the leader of the mortal orcs. He's kind of like, yeah, I mean, but, like, what's going to happen? The Nazgul's going to get shot down again? Because a little bit of context, one of the Nazgul flying on their fell beast was shot down by Legolas as it was flying over the River Anduin as they were sailing down the River Anduin towards the Argonath, so like the two big statues in the movies. And so, fair play, because it's kind of like, yeah, I mean, sure, they're kind of terrifying, but they can also be easily shot down, so that's not swaying me. You're following my orders, I'm not following your orders. But then also another line that I really like that isn't in the movies, but it's in the books, and I believe, I can't remember if it's in the Two Towers or the Return of the King, but it's basically when Frodo is, been captured by the orcs in Cirith after he's been stabbed by Shelob and wrapped into webs, and Sam takes the ring. So basically, at this point, Sam puts on the rings. That way, obviously, he can just go around invisible, not being detected. And he actually overhears a conversation between two orcs. That's something to the effect, I don't remember like verbatim what it says, but it's basically to the effect of these two orcs are basically talking. It's like, yeah, man, can't wait until this war's over, so that way, maybe like we can just kind of escape this place, find our own, like get some good guys together, find our own area, and just kind of, no big bosses, and just kind of do our own thing. So again, it's this tiny little detail that does show that the orcs kind of have their own ambitions. And it's not that they're subservient to Sauron or necessarily even Saruman out of loyalty, but because, like, one, I think partially fear, because especially, one is a wizard and then the other is a Maiar, so you don't really want to piss off either of them. But at the same time, I think part of it too is, again, what Tolkien said, is that the orcs are just inherently, they're more prone to corruption, and so obviously Saruman being master deceivers, it probably was a lot easier for them to, manipulate the orcs and, Uruk-hai and the other different types of orcs to serve their own purposes. But I think this line in particular was probably, like, in my opinion, is kind of the most indicative of the orcs kind of having their own free will. So I think that was something that was, like, some people have, like, heavily debated if the orcs are straight up, like, just fleshy automatons, or if they are beings with their own free will. And to me, that line kind of gives me the impression that the orcs do indeed have their own free will. Maybe not as, maybe not quite as free as, say, any other race, because they're not under the sway of Sauron and just that dark influence. Don't know. But again, it still, to me, shows that, like, they have some ambitions, and who's to say that, maybe after the War of the Ring, the orcs that survived, I think Tolkien did write that, a lot of them just kind of crawled into, like, holes and just kind of never bothered the world anymore. But again, who's to say that some of them, maybe after Sauron was defeated, after, Aragorn and Eomer, once they became kings, continued fighting off, like, the hostile orcs and Easterlings and stuff like that, they were like, you know what, now that I don't have Sauron, I'm just going to kind of kick back in this isolated area with no humans, no elves, no dwarves, and just, I don't know, try farming, I guess, or something, but I don't have to answer to anybody. I think, and as much as I hate to give credit, I think that was what the Rings of Power was trying to do in Season 2, when they showed, like, the orc family. And yes, it is an interesting concept. I just don't think that worked in Rings of Power, nor do I think that really needed to be shown in Rings of Power. Um, but the less said about that show, the better. Um, but I do think, like I said, I think it is an interesting idea to kind of ponder of like a kind of what if, you know, there were some like friendly or non-hostile orcs, and I guess you could, if you're really reaching, you could make the argument too in because basically Tolkien said that the War of the Last Alliance, there's basically every race was fighting on each side except for the elves. The elves were the only ones that fought for the side of good. So there, that kind of gives the impression that there were even some dwarves that maybe fought for Sauron. Um, and again, you could. I feel like it'd still be reaching and maybe taking it too literal. But I guess it is theoretically possible, but I imagine very, very unlikely that there were some orcs that fought for the side of good. Just because I feel like had that happened, even if I don't know, I just feel like that's very unlikely because that probably would have come up at some point, even if it was just in the appendices. So not something that was talked about or addressed in like the books themselves, but something touched upon in the appendices. Um, so again, that's just speculation on my part, though. So like I said, there could be an argument to be made that maybe there were orcs that fought on the side of good and weren't just, all on Sauron's side. But for me personally, I just think that's very unlikely. But that's not to say that, again, after Sauron was defeated, that maybe the orcs just kind of, probably more like the Misty Mountain orcs, because they seemed like they had kind of a bit more autonomy and weren't as directly under Sauron's influence. Like I'm sure he could still muster like the orcs of the Misty Mountains if he wanted to, but they weren't as directly under his control as say the orcs of Gundabad or the orcs of Cirith Ungol, and then obviously the orcs of Mordor. And then obviously he didn't have any sway over the Uruk-hai that Saruman bred, which basically he crossbred humans and orcs, which again, this is kind of, I guess, if you're putting your real life hat on. So if orcs and humans can crossbreed, then obviously that would mean that they have a common ancestor. So, and that's another thing too, is it's some people speculate that orcs weren't just created from elves, but possibly humans as well. And so maybe that could also explain why there's different types of orcs. But again, and I think that's fairly possible because again, if Morgoth could corrupt elves, who's to say he couldn't corrupt humans as well and kind of turn them into orcs or something similar? So like maybe the goblins, which goblins are a little bit shorter in stature than orcs. Maybe those were the humans. I don't know. But yeah, so I just think that it's it's possible that like the again Moria orcs seem to be a little bit more autonomous and have again had they clearly had some kind of system at work in the Misty Mountains, and maybe not like the entire length of the Misty Mountains, but maybe just that particular part of the Misty Mountains in Moria where they had taken up residence. Maybe those specific orcs had some kind of system going where they had some kind of chieftain or possibly even a king, because in The Hobbit there was the Goblin King. So, again, it does show that there is some kind of societal structure to their culture, but I still imagine that when there was societal structure, like whether they had like a monarch like the Goblin King or a chieftain or something like that, it was probably kind of a rarity. And I imagine even when there was some kind of leader, they are probably constantly almost at odds with other orcs, just constantly trying to challenge them to be the new leader. Um, so, so yeah, those are kind of my, as typical fashion with this channel and the way I work is very rambly. But those are kind of my general thoughts on like orcish culture, and again, some of this is pure speculation on my part based on the text. Um, but I don't know. again, especially that line again, I'm pretty sure it's the Return of the King, where the two orcs are basically just talking about like what they want to do after the War of the Ring, and basically just have nothing to do with like Sauron or Nazgul. They're just kind of like, let's just go do our own thing and live happy orc lives, whatever that entails. Um, so yeah, that more or less wraps up this video. I'm sure there's a lot more stuff that I could cover and go more in depth in. But this video is already going like 20 minutes, so I'm going to try and wrap it up now before I ramble anymore. But give me your thoughts below. What do you think about orcish culture, or your theories on the orcs? Do you think that, again, they were more like fleshy automatons? Do you think they had free will? Or, like, how much of this were you even aware of from the books? So, um, do usual YouTubey stuff. Like, comment, subscribe, all that jazz, and until next, everyone, cheers.